Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. I'm Paul from the NHT, and we're here for the webinar, Needy, Anxious, Explosive, Avoidant, and that is by Rebecca Brooks, who is going to talk to you now. So I'll log off and let her carry on with the session. Okay, thank you, Rebecca.
Great, thanks a lot. Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. This is, yes, Needy, Anxious, Explosive, Avoidant, the many faces of trauma in the classroom. As Paul just said, my name is Becky Brooks. I work at Adoption UK, which is a national charity supporting adoptive families, and I'm the education policy advisor there. Before that, in a past life, for a long time, I was a secondary school teacher, and then I was a foster carer, and I'm also an adoptive parent of 2 children, one of whom has special educational needs. So we're talking today about the intersection, really, or the many crossover points between children's early life experiences, the neglect and abuse and traumatic experiences that they may have gone through, and how that may impact them in the school and in the classroom. So let's crack on, because we don't have much time and I'm not known for a short webinar. Let's talk for a moment about what it is that we are meaning when we say trauma and attachment. Now, I don't know if is Paul still there, because there are people in the waiting room. Let's talk about what we mean by a trauma and attachment. Dr. Bruce Perry defines trauma as an experience or a pattern of experiences that impairs the proper functioning of the person's stress response system, making it more reactive or sensitive. And I think when we think about adults experiencing trauma, you may be sitting in your home at the moment, or wherever you are, and you may be able to identify the kinds of events that might be considered traumatic. When we're thinking about very young children, infants, pre-verbal children, what we might mean by trauma might be considered a little bit differently. But I think what's important is that, as Dr. Perry describes it, it impairs the proper functioning of the person's stress response system, making it more reactive or sensitive. The important part about that is that the trauma doesn't need to be remembered in order to do that. So I have some memories from childhood. I have memory of being chased by a dog, and that was quite traumatic for me. But because I have a memory of that, and I can verbalise that, and we can talk about it, I've been able to overcome what was a visceral fear of dogs as a child. But trauma that occurs to children when they are pre-verbal, it isn't stored as conscious memory. It impacts on their development, and it's often stored as sensory somatic kind of memories. And so it impairs the functioning of their stress response system, and it's not necessarily something that can be remembered and therefore talked about and worked through in perhaps the more traditional ways. So when we're talking about children who may be looked after or adopted, and obviously that's my area of expertise, the majority, 75% of adopted children, will have experienced neglect or abuse in early childhood. All of them will have experienced a sudden loss of their birth families. Many of them will have experienced multiple moves through the care system before finding a permanent family, and this will be true of many care experienced children too. And then linked to trauma, but not necessarily the same as it, is this concept that we call attachment, which you're probably all very familiar with. And we're going to define that as the relationship context within which early growth and development takes place, and through which a helpless infant gets their essential needs met. So there is an attachment cycle that goes round hundreds of times a day with an infant. An infant will feel a sensation, an infant will cry because that's the only communicative method they've got. A nurturing and attuned adult will turn up in response to the crying, attempt to discover the reason for the crying, provide what it is the child needs. The child experiences feelings of comfort and safety and calms down, and then that cycle repeats and repeats. And that's a really natural part of parenting that we perhaps don't think too much about. But there are lots of chemical things happening in a child's body when those interactions are taking place, particularly the release of cortisol. And if frequently the child's needs are not met, the crying is not responded to, the nurturing adult doesn't come, then that attachment cycle is broken, and the child learns a very different thing about what the world is like. The child doesn't receive that soothing input from the parent or from the caregiver. They don't, which should later translate into being able to soothe themselves, and to be able to understand that it will be okay, because we will be able to solve this disaster that's occurring to me right now. So I could probably speak to you for half a day on what trauma is and what attachment is. We don't have time for that today, but it's just a very brief context to begin what's to begin to set the foundation for what's coming next in what I'm going to say this morning. Some things that you might see in children who've experienced early life trauma or a broken, disrupted attachment relationships will be related to, if we're looking at trauma, we're looking at an enhanced, a heightened fight, flight and freeze response. So those adrenaline and cortisol fueled responses that may result in a child running, fighting or shutting down. Hypervigilance, so children that are primed from the earliest times to be aware of potential danger and cannot stop looking for that danger and looking out for everything that's going on. We may see children with diagnoses of PTSD or something called CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a diagnosis available in the NHS, where a trauma has been chronic in a child's life. So it's a complex trauma. It's gone on for a period of time, or they've experienced a number of traumatic situations. We may see children experience anxiety and stress. We may see children dissociating, which is linked to the freeze response. I've just noticed that I've written flight, freeze. It should be fight, flight, freeze. Apologies for that. With children who've experienced disrupted attachments, we may see poor self-regulation. Children learn what regulation is through these regulating attachment relationships. If that's not there, the opportunity to learn that isn't there. We may see children who maximise their level of need in order to get somebody to come and help them, or who minimise their level of need because they've become completely self-reliant and don't see the point in trying to expect someone else to come and help them. We may see children who have a very low resilience in the face of challenge. We may see children with very low self-confidence. We may see delayed language development. So, I mean, really, if you think about early language development, it is in the context of that earliest attachment relationship. The nursery rhymes, the cooing that adults do with very young children, if that's not taking place during these incredibly important early years where the brain is still forming, because we are not born with fully formed brains, so the brain is still forming, the synaptic development is still taking place. So if the environment is not conducive to the development of those aspects of the brain development, then they won't develop. So we can see all kinds of delayed developments, but particularly in terms of language and in terms of executive function. This is incredibly common to have executive function difficulties amongst children who have experienced early life adverse experiences. So what does this mean when children are coming into schools? What I want to get across today is that there is a huge intersection between these issues of trauma and attachment and also issues of special educational needs and disabilities and development. We know that children who are looked after are more likely to have special educational needs. We ran a survey last year of adoptive parents with nearly 5,000 respondents representing well over 5,000 children. 36 in England, 36% of the children represented in the survey had an EHCP, and a further 40% were receiving SEN support in school. So it's an enormous proportion. Now, this was a self-selecting survey of 5,000 parents. The data isn't collected from the DFE on previously looked after children's SEND, but we suspect that adopted children are more likely to have SEND. And we need to look as well at the prevalence of neurodiverse conditions, particularly fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Conservative estimates suggest that 3 to 5% of the population are affected by prenatal alcohol exposure and possibly are diagnosable with FASD, which makes it 3 to 5 times more common than autism. In terms of looked after children, a small scale study in Peterborough which looked at the medicals that children were having in that local authority area as they came into care and then as they went on to be adopted, found that around a third of children who came into care, prenatal alcohol exposure was implicated, and in children who went on to adoption, it was around 3/4 of those children prenatal alcohol exposure was implicated. So we suspect that the prevalence of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is a neurodiverse spectrum condition affecting a lot of areas, would be considerably higher amongst children who've experienced neglectful or chaotic environments in early childhood. But as I've said, we also suspect amongst adopted children that there is a higher prevalence of other neurodiverse conditions. Again, in the survey I was mentioning earlier, we saw a rate amongst respondents of autistic spectrum disorder 7 times higher than the national average, and ADHD was similarly higher than the national average. So when we speak to adoptive parents, the majority of adoptive parents we speak to, their children have experienced early life trauma, often do have attachment difficulties due to disrupted attachments, and also have special educational needs that are recognised and diagnosed, as well as possibly a range of developmental delay. So we've already mentioned speech and language delay. There can be physical developmental delay. This is just as an example of this, for instance, in a very young infant, and an occupational therapist explained this to me, in a very young infant, the muscular development takes place in stages. It begins with the neck and then the core, and then spreads from the core to the limbs and then to the fingers, the fine motor skills. And the occupational therapist explained to me that these are each stage is foundational to the next. So if your tiny infant is left to lie in a cot for many hours a day, isn't picked up, isn't rocked, isn't that core, those areas will be weak, and that weakens the development of all the subsequent physical development that takes place. So what you can find years down the line is children with very poor fine motor skills, for instance, but it is linked to early neglect, poorly developed sensory systems, and as well undiagnosed conditions. So when children have a very chaotic early life experience, it is possible that they're not seen by medical professionals, perhaps when they need to be. We see children with dental difficulties, for instance, that are not seen to, causing actually immense pain and difficulty for them later on. So it's possible that children with these chaotic early life experiences are sitting in classrooms in pain, with physical difficulties, with undiagnosed conditions that are yet to be dealt with. And in education too, because children who move through the care system can often miss out on large chunks of their early education. Education professionals haven't had the opportunity to sit with and work with that child and identify any potential difficulties. So children can often be recognised as having difficulties later than otherwise would have happened. Now, when we talk about behaviour, I'm just putting this out here because I spend a fair bit of time on social media, and I sometimes see this kind of conversation taking place where there seem to be polar opposite views, and I'm absolutely certain that most professionals don't polarise themselves to this extent. But you'll see people on one side shouting that behaviour is communication, all behaviour is communication, and then you'll see people shouting across the chasm, no, behaviour is a choice, we choose how we behave. I sometimes think it's not a terribly helpful debate, because I do think behaviour communicates, actually. All our behaviour communicates something. But if I'm completely honest, some of my behaviour at school indicated that I didn't really like French and didn't want to be there, really. And so sometimes we can be very reductive in the way that we talk about children's behaviour in school. And I'm looking for more helpful ways to define or to describe the drivers of children's behaviour, bearing in mind those 4 elements that we looked at on the previous screen. So I tend to prefer to say behaviour as a context. There's a driver to behaviour. It is probably communicating something. The thing it's communicating may or may not be helpful for you to know in that moment. And even if you do know what is being communicated, that may not be helpful in terms of what you're going to do next. Because if little Sarah has picked up a chair and is about to throw it across the classroom, even if you know the behaviour that's being communicated in that moment, you need to do something about the chair throwing that's taking place. It's not so something instantaneous needs to happen. But there are many contexts of the behaviour, but I'm picking on 2 at the moment. I'm picking on an individual's personal context, and that we're looking also at the situational context. So I think as a minimum, every time we see a behaviour from a child or young person, there is a personal, individual to them context of that behaviour, and there is also a situational context, what is taking place around them that is impacting their behaviour. Now, I want to tell you about a time when I engaged in some really bad behaviour, not that long ago, actually, terrible bad behaviour. I got in my car and I drove in speeds hugely in excess of the speed limit for a built-up area. I skipped a red light. I cut other cars up and drove in front of them. I picked my horn to get them out of the way. I drove like a maniac to a particular location. When I got to that location, I parked haphazardly in a space that was reserved for somebody else. went out of my car and went into the building where there was a queue, demanded that I be seen in front of all those other people and be given a special place at the front of the queue. Now, at any point in that, I've broken the law. I've broken all kinds of sort of moral and social codes. You know, you don't run to the front of the queue and demand to be seen. At any point in that, somebody in authority would have been well within their rights to stop me and put some kind of consequence, punish me in some way, or put a consequence, or demand to know what was going on. My personal context is that I'm actually a fairly law-abiding person as a whole. I don't regularly pick up lots of speeding fines. I have been on a speed awareness course once, for the sake of full disclosure, but this is not normally how I drive. I've been driving for 25, longer, nearly 30 years. Is that right? No, 25 years. I'm not that old. And in general, I'm a very safe and calm driver, and pay attention to others on the road and don't drive through red lights. That's my personal context. But what was my situational context in that moment when I was making those really out of character and crazy decisions? The situational context was that my 1-year-old daughter's head had swelled up to the size of a beach ball. This was not something I'd seen before. Her eyes were swollen shut. Her lips looked like they were going to explode. I couldn't tell if she was actually properly breathing or not. And it was very frightening. And I responded in that moment with pure, unfiltered adrenaline response. Now, looking back on it, I probably made some quite bad decisions in that moment. And in fact, when we got to the hospital, for that's where I was going, and pushed to the front of the queue, shouting like somebody out of casualty, help me, help me. The medical professionals did say to me, you'd have been better off staying where you were and calling an ambulance, and which I had not done, because I knew I was less than 5 minutes away from the hospital. But what they informed me, which I didn't know, was that the ambulance station was actually nearer to where I was than the hospital was. So if I'd called an ambulance, I probably would have had an ambulance there quicker than I could have got my child to the hospital. And then they would have been able to start with immediate treatment, and I wouldn't have had to put all of our lives at risk, and other people's actually, by driving like a crazy lunatic through the centre of town. So yes, I made some bad decisions. I made those bad decisions because I wasn't thinking straight, because I was in a moment of crisis. I've never done that again. It turned out that my child has quite a range of interesting allergies, and has had quite a lot of interesting allergy reactions since then. She was fine, by the way, on that occasion, and on every other one in the end. But what is it that has meant that I haven't behaved in that way again when the same situation has arisen again? Two things. First of all, we found out what was causing the situation. So we found out the causes of my distress and her distress, and we put in place a plan to, as far as possible, prevent those types of situations from arising again. So the situation that fueled my adrenaline response is now much less likely to happen, because I understand what is going on and I have a plan. Now, I will just say that as an adult with a fairly well-developed regulatory system, I am probably much better placed to consistently put that plan in place than a child who hasn't learned those self-regulation skills yet. But nonetheless, it's vital. And the other thing is that if it does happen again, I have another plan, a plan for what to do when that starts to happen. So I have a preventative plan and I have a response plan. We have medications, we have EpiPens, we have all of this thing. So when it happens again, I have a written thing: do this. If this doesn't work, do this. If this doesn't work, dial 999, do this. So we have it all laid out, and I've gone over it when I'm calm and when we're not in crisis, and I've learned it, and now I know what I'm supposed to do. As I've said, as an adult, that's probably much easier to take on board quickly than it would be for a child with a range of difficulties. But what I'm saying is, our personal and situational context can be massive drivers in our behaviour. I 100% knew that I was behaving badly when I put my child in the car and drove her faster than the speed limit to get to the hospital. I know that you're not allowed to do that. I knew I was breaking the rules. But in that moment, there was no consequence that you could have applied to me, really, in terms of a speeding ticket or a fine, that would have prevented me from continuing to break the rules, because the crisis that I was experiencing was a bigger thing to me than the possible consequences of what I was doing. And we see that in children sometimes too, that there is no consequence that we can apply to them that would outweigh the distress or the experience that they are currently having. right in front of us in the classroom. If you have already lost your entire family and you believe yourself to be the worst student in the school and you believe that you have no hope of success anyway, and you have all this negative self-thought going on, and some of that's been backed up by terrible experiences that you've had in your life, then a detention probably isn't going to be enough of a deterrent to stop you walking out of the building that day when you've decided that's what you need to do, just to be completely blunt. So let's move on from my criminal past. So for instance, we might look at a personal context where we know a child has sensory processing difficulties. And then if we add that to a situational context where like a lot of schools, where it is noisy, it is crowded, it is visually stimulating around the environment, we're likely to get some results. It's like an equation. You add this personal context to this situational context and you're likely to get some kind of behavioural results. It may be that and think back to our fight, flight and freeze responses. It may be the child needs to get away or hide under the table, or is going to develop, is going to become anxious, and you're going to see a lot of anxiety fueled behaviours. Let's look at the context of a child who has a deep negative self-belief or a deep sense of shame. And this is incredibly common amongst children who have experienced abuse and neglect and who have lost their families. It really doesn't matter how often you say it wasn't your fault. The internalized shame, sometimes called toxic shame, is very hard to overcome. If you already believe yourself to be the worst person that could possibly exist, and then you add that to a situational context where your behaviour is being monitored by sticker charts and public behaviour charts, and where your grades are being put up on a list in the room and everyone can look at them, it's a challenging situation for children. Now, to be honest, anybody, certainly at my school, they would read out our exam results in front of the whole class every year, and yeah, it could be extremely difficult. Because sometimes you tried your best and you still didn't really do very well, and there it was for everybody to see. You were 27th out of 28 or whatever. It's very difficult. I hope those kinds of things are not really done anymore, because this was in the 80s and we hope that things have moved on. But one of my areas of conversation that I like to have quite often is around the public display of children's behavioural achievements and attainment achievements, how we are dealing with those. And children being on basically children being on the cloud or being on the red traffic light day after day after day. For children who have a healthy view of themselves and the world, this may be effective. For those who are on the green traffic light a lot, it probably reinforces what they already know about themselves, and that they're doing pretty well and that everything's okay. And that a slight dip can be easily overcome because they know they can get on the green traffic light because they're usually on the green traffic light. But for children that are perpetually on the red traffic light, that also reinforces their view of themselves, which I'm no good, and they already think that. And so I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes conventional methods, which may seem to be appropriate for most children, can have surprising and opposite results with some children that you might be working with, particularly if they've got issues relating to attachment and trauma. Certainly we hear of young people gathering negative feedback like a sort of badge of honour, really, because they've given up any hope of getting onto the green traffic light, but they still want to have some sense of achievement or some sense of looking good, or I don't know, they don't want to admit in front of the peers that they feel bad about being on the red traffic light. So the alternative is to view that as a badge of honour. I've been on the red traffic light, look at me. None of you can be on the red traffic light as much as I can, and it becomes self-perpetuating. So if we're thinking about behaviour in context, we can look at maybe two types of behaviour that we might be talking about. And so we see children acting in, so the behaviour is internalised, the response to the personal and situational context is internalised within them. So we might see silence, we might see what looks like defiance. We may see a lot of hiding behaviours, masking. We may see copying and cheating to cover up and struggling to do the work or not having understood what the teacher said. And in this case, we're talking about children whose relationships with others are avoidant. So when we're looking at children who have learned that really they must be totally self-reliant in order to survive, these are survival instincts, there's no point putting your hand up to ask the teacher. That's terribly exposing and dangerous in this context. And so anything that you can do to hide your struggle, if you haven't understood the work or you're not sure what you're supposed to be doing, then you'll copy off somebody else, or you'll find some way, or you'll avoid it somehow, or you'll procrastinate. They may appear to lack engagement. They may appear to be bored. They might tell lies and distract you and try to move things away. This is acting in behaviour. And often acting in behaviour is, I think, in some senses less understood than acting out behaviour, because I think when we talk about behaviour, we're nearly always talking about acting out behaviour. Often we're talking about disruptive behaviour, persistent chatter, abusive language, and behaving in an abusive way towards others, violence, angry behaviour, accusing, blaming, meltdowns. Also distracting can be acting out behaviour. But when we think about behaviour in school, or when I think about behaviour in school that I have really struggled with in the past, or that has been memorable for me, perhaps I shall say, rather than a struggle, it's acting out behaviour, because that's what disrupts the classroom. That's what you need to do something about in the moment, because it can escalate and become dangerous. And children who are acting in are often much less disruptive in the classroom and can easily slip through the cracks. Now, recently I produced a report for Adoption UK called Better Futures, and we were looking at adopted children's experience of further education. I spoke to a young girl she was 21 actually, so she was a young lady really, but she had, I mean, really, it was quite staggering what she'd been able to achieve. She had managed to get through the entire secondary school, barely able to read and write, without any diagnosis of special educational needs. She had got no qualification, she'd got no GCSE, she'd got nothing when she came to leave. She could not get on a college course. It was very difficult for her. And I was speaking to her and her parent, and I said, how did this happen? And she said, well, I just used to hide. I spent all of secondary school hiding. I hid, I copied everything all of the time. Toilet.
Hello, Rebecca. Sorry to interrupt you. We've lost your sound.
I didn't do any of it. I didn't understand what was going on. And I didn't want people looking at me. So I used to always get to the class first so that I could already be in there, so that everyone wouldn't look at me when I walked in. And then when it got too much people looking at me, or when I thought the teacher was going to ask me any questions, or I thought I was going to be found out that I didn't know what was going on, I asked to go to the toilet and never went back to class for the rest of the day. She did this for 5 years. I mean, in some ways it's extraordinary. But I guess I'm explaining this because she slipped through the net in some ways, because she didn't actually present or pose a challenge to anybody. There was no acting out behaviour. There was no throwing things or shouting or swearing at the teachers or persistent disruption or any of those things. She just hid. She just hid for 5 years, and somehow managed to get away with it. So for me, the acting in behaviours that we see as a result of trauma, special needs, all of that range of things, is as vital to pay attention to as the acting out behaviours, even though the acting out behaviours are the ones that will try the hardest to draw our attention. Let's think about some children, and I'm going to ask you at the end of this to pop some things in the chat, which I hope I can see, because otherwise this will not work at all. But we'll do what we can. So I'm going to do. There we go. I'm going to turn the chat on. Oh, there's already some things in the chat. I do apologise. I didn't have it open before. Cool. So the chat's working. So let's talk briefly about James, and then I'm going to ask you to pop in the chat if you'd like to. Anything, what you think might be going on with James. So James is a year 7 pupil who's been in local authority care for 6 months. In class, he's constantly calling out and drawing attention to himself. He takes any opportunity to start a conversation with his teacher, often interrupting others. He shouts out. He asks trivial questions. He always seems to have something to say. It's as though he needs his teacher's attention on him all of the time. So does anybody, if you want to pop in the chat, what do you think is going on with James? If we're going to be behaviour detectives, what do you think is James's personal context here? Oh yes, we've got a new message. So someone saying he's developmental like a toddler, avoiding work, feeling insecure, needs reassurance, late into care maybe, attachment disorder. James is looking at reassurance again, more attachment, milestones. He might be trying to get the teacher off task because he can't do the work. I love that. Needs attention, yes, trusted adults, all of that. Brilliant. I hope everyone can see these comments that have come up in the chat. This is great. We are behaviour detectives today. Developmental delay, seeking reassurance. Yes, he needs to know he's noticed. He needs to connect. Very good. I'm sure that's very true. Do you know, I think it could be any of those things. Hypervigilance, that's an interesting one. Yes, has learned that these behaviour choices get him the attention he craves. He may be building trust. He's trying to develop a relationship with his teacher. Maybe he doesn't feel like anyone else will listen. These are all great responses. These are all great responses. I mean, this is what we would call, I mean, really, we would call it, if you really had to describe it and you were going to use your non-PC language, you'd call it attention seeking. James is attention seeking. Okay. And what we want to do in terms of talking about attention seeking is really try and reframe that. And think about attachment seeking. We all need attachment. We all need to be in relationships with other people. We all have attachment relationships with people. Now, our primary attachment relationship should be with our primary caregivers when we're young, but we'll also have a range of secondary attachment relationships, and that's healthy and normal. So with an infant, it starts with your primary caregiver, and then it gradually expands, other caregivers, wider family, and then moving out to people at maybe nursery and friends, and your circle of people that you're attached to gets bigger and bigger. And within all of that context, you learn how to make a relationship. We need these relationships, and we need to learn how to make and maintain and sustain these relationships. I think James doesn't know how to do that. So yes, as many people have said, and I don't think I've seen anything on this list that couldn't possibly be the case. So there could be a range of things going on. I suggested attachment. I've suggested poor grasp of permanency, which is related to feeling that unless someone's attention is on you all the time, you're completely forgotten about. It's in that sense of permanency, that you need to know that you've been held in someone's mind, because you're not able to hold on to their presence with you unless it's reinforced all the time. It could be anxiety. Someone mentioned he's struggling to do the work, so he's trying to distract. So yes, it could be anxiety about work or anything else that's going on. And the situational context here is that James is separated from his caregiver, all of his caregivers. So he's separated from his birth family, whoever was his caregiver then. And as a foster carer, I must say that however, and this is quite sensitive, but however much we feel that a child, for their own safety, needs to be separated from their birth family in that moment, it is a desperate trauma for a child. That separation is a desperate trauma for a child. Even if they were in a terrible situation, still it is a significant rupture, and it does have an impact, even if it's for their own safety. So he's separated from his caregiver in the long term, and also in the short term from his foster carer, and he's sharing attention with 30 others, and he's new to secondary school. He's in year 7. So all this is going on. So is it attachment seeking? What can we do then? Well, let's establish a safe base. So we need attachment takes place in a safe base. So in an infant, the safe base is the relationship between the primary caregiver and the child. That's the safe base, and the child will not go very distant from that. We'll always return to that. And as the child gets older, the circles that they go out and explore the world in get bigger and bigger, but they always need to know that they're going to come back to their safe base. In a school situation, a child will leave their safe base, which should be their home, and go out to school and know that at the end of a long day they're going to come back to their safe base, and that is what it roots them and it anchors them. Now, for children whose home isn't the safe base that it perhaps ought to be for a number of reasons, they're going to need also school to feel like a safe base. So how can we establish school as a safe base? And it will be in the context of what's called a secondary attachment relationship. So giving the child the opportunity to have a relationship in school which is professional, because we're obviously school staff and not the child's parents, but also safe, checking in with them day to day, checking in with them every morning, for instance, checking in at lunchtime, just checking in and being that safe base so that the child feels anchored where they are. Maybe sit the child close to the teacher, maybe give the child plenty of positive low-key attention, a nod, a smile, a thumbs up. Maybe the child will benefit from having a key adult in school to provide that safe base to check in regularly. In terms of the child interrupting, I'm using the phrase acknowledge and hold. So acknowledge the child is speaking, acknowledge the child is attempting to get your attention, and kind of gently put them on hold. James, I've seen you, just one moment. Yes, James, just one more, yes, James, so that this could be done in a very visual way. James needs the teacher's attention. He puts a card on his desk. Teacher says, I've seen your card, James. I'll be with you in a moment. And then comes when it's at the time that's convenient for the teacher. So we're going back to what we said about my law-breaking driving experience, which is if we know what is happening, we can put a plan in place to prevent it, and we can put a plan in place about what to do after it happens. What time are we on? We're all right for time, so let's move to another. Let's talk about Sophie. Sophie is in year 4. She was adopted when she was just turned 3. Sophie is forever turning round and craning her neck at every sound and movement in the classroom. She finds it hard to concentrate on her work, and her teacher said she's easily distracted. Someone's in there straight away in capital letters. She's falling behind, and none of the usual behaviour strategies seem to have any effect. Somebody has written in the chat in capital letters, hypervigilance. I'm not sure much more needs to be said. Yes, sensory seeking. Yeah, I think you've got this. Yeah, some great answers coming up. Need to sit with back to all and be able to see the class door adults. Yeah, sit with back to overview room. Yeah, door. Brilliant, guys. Well done. Brilliant. Sensory integration. Oh, I'm loving it. Sensory processing. Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, you've sorted Sophie straight away. Sophie's not too complex in that sense. So what's Sophie's personal context? Maybe she's experiencing anxiety. Maybe she has a history of abuse, toxic stress, or domestic violence in her early childhood, which has created a situation where she perceives herself to be in danger. And so her stress response system has developed to always be ready to respond to danger in a way that other children are not necessarily quite so high response. And yes, sensory processing, all of those things. And the situational context for Sophie in this moment is that the classroom is busy and it's full of noises and movement and smells. And frankly, if your stress response system is in overdrive, every one of those noises or little movements out of the corner of the eye or smells gets your adrenaline going, shoots cortisol to you and puts you in a fight, flight or freeze response. You can't calm down. My oldest, is extremely hypervigilant, and I've often suggested that was what makes him so good in defence and goalkeeping at football, because he doesn't miss a thing. He's continually aware all the time. He sees everything, he remembers everything, he knows everything that everybody said. He pays incredibly close attention to everything that is going on in his environment at all times. And actually, in some ways, it's like a superpower. But in other ways, if you just think about living like that, that is intensely exhausting. And he is pretty much exhausted most of the time. So yes, we're talking about hypervigilance and any of the other things you've mentioned in the chat, really, because there's often there can be a range of contexts and a range of causes. So, but if we're looking at hypervigilance, let's maximise safety. Can we sit the child fairly close to the teacher, but in a place where they can view the whole room, and in particular see the door? It's terrible for hypervigilant children to have their back to the door. Can we, preferably up against a wall is best, actually, to the side of the room, nearish to the front, not in a place where they should be walking back behind them all the time to get the scissors or whatever. provide a calm space. Sometimes this child will need a calm space to just regulate themselves, and to just reduce the amount of sensory input they're getting. Prepare this child in advance for any changes. So is there going to be a visit to the classroom? Is there going to be a change to the timetable? Is there going to be a change to anything? Prepare the child in advance. Make sure the child's parents or carers know, so that the parents and carers can partner with you in preparing that chance. Yes, someone's put their pre-warn for change or visitors with a visual picture, excellent visual timetables, and provide sensory breaks for the child. I'm saying that if nothing else, because sitting there, as I've mentioned, being hypervigilant all day long on your chair is desperately tiring. This child is likely to be very tense, very physically tense. So look for signs of physical tension, look for signs of tensed up muscles, tensed up faces. And of course, that can actually lead to just kind of physical discomfort and physical pain. People are putting some great suggestions in the chat, by the way, if you want to open the chat: visual timetables, social stories, those kinds of things. But it's in a child's position in the classroom, to take down the level of input that they're trying to process, and basically, I mean, it's as simple as this. Sophie's doing her maths. She thinks she hears something at the door. If the door's behind her, she has to turn right round to look at it. If she can see it by just raising her head, she can basically look up, see that it's nothing, and get on. Her anxiety is calmed, and it didn't take a lot of time out of her work off task from her maths. Watch out for subtle self-harm, someone's put, like skin picking and lip chewing. Absolutely. Okay, so signs of anxiety, this internalizing of behaviour. This is a great group. I'm loving this today. I'm going to just briefly mention some of the flashpoints. I could go on with the you guys are so great in the chat. I could go on with the case studies all day, but let's just mention some flashpoints that can often be the situational context that causes all kinds of behavioural interest. So transitions is obvious. We know that transition is very difficult, and there's a range of transitions on there. From one activity to another is a particular one that sometimes gets overlooked, but that can be really difficult, particularly if a child has problems with executive function. It's just impossible to make that mental list of what you need to do to finish this thing and start that next thing. Suggestion for that, particularly children who really struggle if they've not finished or start to panic if they're not going to finish in time, is to just have a designated place for them to put unfinished work they can come back to later. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but just, it's okay, we have a plan for this. We have a plan for if you haven't finished. We're going to put it here for later. Curriculum triggers. Funnily enough, I was messaged by a parent this morning saying her child's year 8 class is watching Lion or find out what's obviously. So can I just mention curriculum triggers? Evacuees. I mean, some children are completely unfazed by this kind of thing, but please don't assume that because the last adopted child in front of you will be fine with this. They're individuals. There's no kind of one. So and a few chapters, it can just be difficult for children, and while they may not show any sign of responding in the classroom, what can often happen is that the children masking that go home and give their parents an extremely hard time, or their carers. Genetics. Oh yeah, bring in baby photographs from when you were a baby. That's not so good if you don't have any of those. Go home and find out the eye colour of everyone in your family, and we'll use that to talk about genetics. That doesn't work if the people in your family are not genetically related to you. There's just a lot of things like this, some of which can cause anxiety and anxiety-fueled behaviours, but others are just awkward, because what are you going to do when you can't bring a baby photograph in? Are you going to have to tell everybody that in your class that you're adopted? Are you going to bring a fake photograph and pretend it's you when really it isn't? I mean, these are just difficult, and it's worth looking for ways round these before they become an issue. any out of routine event, Mother's and Father's Day. To be honest, Mother's Day particularly can be particularly difficult for care experienced children, for reasons which are fairly self-evident, really. And for adopted children, it can be a very conflicting day. The average age for a child to be adopted is around 3.5. So actually a lot of children who are adopted have memories of their birth families and their birth mums. Some of them will have a direct contact with birth family members. Most will be writing letters to birth family members every year. So it's not a case with adoption of we walk away and never think about those people again. That's not how it works. And so Mother's Day can be very conflicting because these children have two mothers, the adoptive one and the birth one, and different families deal with that in different ways. Any trip, holiday, staff absence, all of these things can ruin a routine, and it can trigger off all this stuff. Unstructured time. In a survey we did of adoptive parents, 60% of parents said that their children had difficulties during unstructured time, for which we can read, get into trouble during unstructured time. So free, like what I'm calling free running. I think schools are a bit more on top of this these days, but you remember that moment of the bell going and the kids just like emerging into the playground, particularly at primary school, at the speed of light, and then running around for the entire playtime. It whips up children's, while it's good for children to get out and have this physical activity, it's a great sensory break, but it whips up children's adrenaline and excitement, and then it can be very hard to put that all back in the bottle to get them back quiet in the playground. So that's an important transition, the sensory and regulatory difference between the quiet of the classroom and the running around of the playground. Some children need support with that. Food issues are incredibly common. I remember a kinship carer whose child in year 4, well, he got in trouble every lunchtime because he was fighting with children in the lunch queue. It happened nearly every day, and he kept missing his playtime because of it. And can I please ask that you at least consider whether missing playtime is an appropriate response for some of these children who will have sensory difficulties and will need that sensory break of getting out in the playtime. It can be counterproductive, so it's just something to really consider. And what she works with the teacher, and what they felt the cause was that the child needed to be first in the queue because of historical very severe food deprivation and food insecurity. And so the teacher just basically stood in front of the class and said, hey, look, this boy, he's really struggling in the queue, so we're going to just let him stand at the front, and that's okay because everyone's still going to get the food. And the kids were remarkably fine with it. And so for the rest of that year, he just went straight to the front of the food queue. There was no more fighting. He didn't get any more detentions for that. And by year 6, he didn't need to do that anymore. So I think as well, when we're making it, adjustments for children that feels as though we're letting them in some way get away with something, or we're giving them some sort of privilege and they'll never learn independence, and they need to learn to manage these things for themselves. And of course, absolutely we do, but we need to start where children are at and build them towards where we want them to be, because wishing they were where we would want them to be doesn't get them where we want them to be. So with this boy, they started where he was at, which was that he wasn't coping. But before he left primary school, he then was coping with that. And it was everybody working together overcame that. It massively reduces anxiety about whether he was going to get any food or not. And after 1.5 years of being first in the queue and absolutely guaranteed the food, that need really left him, and he didn't need to do that anymore. Bullying and peer relationships, moving safely around a crowded school, hygiene and toileting. One of the lesser spoken about sensory needs or senses is this sense of interoception, which is understanding the signals that our body is sending to us. Children who have poorly developed sensory systems may also have a poorly developed sense of interoception, as in they may not recognize what the feeling of being thirsty is, or the feeling of being hungry, or the feeling of needing the toilet. So sometimes these basic self-care things can need additional input. And work stress, obviously, for any child can be a flashpoint, and particularly around children who've experienced trauma and attachment difficulties. We're coming towards for a landing now, I think. I wanted to briefly mention some general principles that adoptive parents and parents and carers of care experienced children find particularly useful. On the left of this slide is the theory of windows of tolerance by Dr. Dan Siegel, who you may have come across. And we've talked about this with sideways on as we've gone through the slides. But what I want to mention to you is this idea of window of tolerance, that most of us spend most of our time within our window of tolerance. We can tolerate what's going on. We're doing okay. We feel calm. We're in control. There might be stresses, but they don't concern us too much. We're able to cope. We know what we're supposed to do. If you think back to my panic drive to the hospital with my child, I was well out of my window of tolerance, but now I've got a plan and I understand what I'm supposed to be able to do. I feel able to cope. So now even when my child has an allergic reaction, I stay within my window of tolerance and can respond to that rationally and using the plan. What happens when we are pushed out of our window of tolerance is we can move into hyperarousal, stressed, anxious, out of control, fight and flight, or we can move into hypoarousal, frozen, shutting down, dissociative, avoidant. Now this is true of all of us, but what Dan Siegel suggests is that children who've experienced a lot of early life trauma, attachment difficulties and all of those, will have a smaller window of tolerance than other people. Okay, so when we're working with children, what we want to do is keep them in their window of tolerance as much as possible, but also with the aim of increasing the size of their window of tolerance. So thinking back to the young boy who had to go to the front of the dinner queue, you know, he had a very small window of tolerance when it came to queuing for dinner. So the first thing they did was work out what they could do to initially keep him inside that window of tolerance, and then work with him over a period of time to increase the size of his window of tolerance, so that later on, being at the back of the dinner queue, he would still be within his window of tolerance, whereas before that would have pushed him into a hyper-aroused state and he would have started fighting and getting stressed and anxious. And so none of the things I'm talking to you about are forever. It's not destiny, okay? The change can happen, and there is positivity in the future. It's just that we need to know what we're talking about and what we can do to help people to increase this window of tolerance. And the other general principle there is Dr. Bruce Perry. It's the 3 R's: regulate, relate and reason. You've probably come across it before. And the basic principle is that if a child is outside of their window of tolerance, you are not reasoning with them and they cannot reason with you. It's not happening. And so first of all, we regulate the children or young child or young person, which means we try and bring them back into their window of tolerance. Then we re-establish the relationship between us, so that's the context in which we're having the later conversation that we need to have. And then we bring in our reasoning conversation, where we talk about what has happened, why it might have happened, what's going to need to happen next as a result of that. I'm just going to pop these general principles up there. I'm not going to go through all of them because they're fairly self-evident. I will just mention the last one: whole school approach versus individual interventions. I was a secondary school teacher. I was a music teacher actually, and that meant that most classes that I taught, I only had them once a week for an hour, and so literally hundreds of children came through my music classroom every week. And at the beginning of the year, they would bring this big stack of paperwork, and these were all the IEPs. I'm going back a few years now, and it's a lot to manage. Okay, and if you're thinking that if we're presenting this as individual interventions that need to be made for every child that's struggling with these kinds of things, then that is a workload on teachers that may be, you know, just too much to deal with, considering that there are many children in school with particular additional needs, and all of which need to be dealt with. And I would just encourage you to think about what a whole school approach might look to that incorporates these things. My suggestion is that a whole school approach that is attachment and trauma informed, or that shows awareness of these principles, will do no harm to any child, and will benefit a lot of children, and will mean that you perhaps create an environment where you have to do fewer individual interventions for children that are finding it particularly difficult. And the other one I wanted to mention was high structure and high nurture. Sometimes it gets said, things are said like, oh crumbs, it's just letting them get away with it, and it couldn't be further from the truth. Children who've experienced traumatic early lives, they need boundaries, they need consistency, they need to understand what's expected of them. They need that as much, if not more, than other children. This is not about throwing the rules in the bin and just letting children run around like crazies. It absolutely isn't. It is a highly structured environment, but it is accompanied by very high levels of nurture. And we're looking all the time. If you think back to my ambulance, when I became an ambulance, we're looking all the time at what we can put in place to support the child before things go wrong, and what we put in place after things have gone wrong, all of which is needs to be in the context of a really quite settled structure, because it is in structure and expectations and consistency that children feel safe, and more than anything else, children need to feel safe. Someone's mentioned PACE. Yes, PACE, absolutely very important. That's a parenting, an acronym for parenting that works well in schools as well. It stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And it's a way of approaching our relationships with children, that we accept the feelings that they're having, and we are curious with them about what is going on with them. Now, I'm being told I've got 5 minutes left, which is very true. Do I have a recommended book from Daniel Siegel? Off the top of my head, I can't think of a title off the top of my head. Does anybody else have anything from Daniel Siegel they want to recommend in the chat? No. No Drama Discipline, someone saying. I could recommend, yeah, No Drama Discipline. Let's see. Brainstorm, The Power and the Purpose of the, Mind Sight. Somebody's, yeah, he's got quite a lot. But No Drama Discipline is probably worth looking at. Thanks for that. The Whole Child Brain. I might recommend The Attachment and Trauma Aware Classroom by someone called Rebecca Brooks. I would recommend also books by Louise Bomber. If you want to look at it from a parenting perspective, Sarah Naish has written some really fantastic books with a lot of principles from a parenting perspective that really help to understand what it is that's happening when children are struggling because of attachments and trauma. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been absolutely fantastic to speak to you today. Thank you for coming along. I'm going to put my work email address in the chat to everyone. I'm absolutely happy for any follow-up questions or anything like that. And I'm going to hand back to Paul, is it? There we go, yeah. That's my email address. I'm going to hand back to Paul because we have some slides from our sponsors.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for a really interesting conversation this morning. This event is being run again in the next session if anyone wants to rejoin us. But the second session workshop will begin at 10:20, so everyone needs to log out and log back into the new session that you wish to attend. But if you want to join us again in the next session, Rebecca and I will be here for you, and you can run through the whole thing again. But for the moment now, we'll say thank you very much, Rebecca, for a really, really interesting talk, and we hope everybody enjoys the day and the sessions that they've received so far.
Great day, everybody.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll end this session now, and as I say, everyone can then go back to their program and join a new session for 11:20. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.